Good afternoon. Let us begin with the questions that we have after the previous lecture. Question. Tell me please, egregorial matrix governance. What priority of generalized means of governance is this? Egregorial matrix governance is not a priority of generalized means, since all 6 priorities of generalized means of governance, equally weaponry, exist and operate within the framework of egregorial matrix governance or self-governance. Any of these priorities can be governed by egregorial matrix means. Therefore, this is not a priority, this is where the priorities are implemented. Question. How do you relate to Victor Plikin's model of the universe? In your lectures you mentioned that the study of sociology, political science and so on, it is better to start by studying biology. Please tell me what I should read, to whom I should listen and where. Are there structures, higher educational institutions in the Russian Federation, on the basis of which it would be possible to get a higher education, adequate from the point of view of the conception of social safety and the sufficiently general theory of governance? Thank you. Well, in the reverse order, there are currently no higher educational institutions and structures where you can get higher education in accordance with the conception of social safety and the sufficiently general theory of governance. Educational standards of all higher educational institutions, all curricula, are tailored to serve the liberal market economic model. Therefore, the closer to social philosophical disciplines, the more nonsense and demagoguery there is in the curriculum. As for the study of biology, in principle, school textbooks of general biology, botany, zoology, they contain all the necessary minimum of information, which makes it possible to understand that man is a biological both object and subject. Therefore, you just need to remember what was taught at school and expand your horizons based on reading works of both a popular scientific and specific scientific applied character. There are no restrictions here, since self-education is, in fact, the best way to personally develop and advance. I have no particular relation to Victor Plikin's model of the universe because I don't know what it is. Next question. Wouldn't it be more accurate, in ultimately generalized terms, to define measure as a feeling of love? It is precisely love which has the greatest completeness in comparison with the conclusions of the intellect. Note, fascism is exposed quickly. I would not say that measure is a feeling of love, because love is a subjective quality, and regardless of whether this or that subject has it, he is its carrier or not. Nonetheless, the world exists as a triunity of matter, information, measure. In fact, love poorly lends herself to formalization and codification, because that in which some circumstances love expresses herself, in other circumstances villainy can express itself, and vice versa. Question: I would like to clarify. In our country, successfully operating companies that work out network modeling systems that allow us to build purpose-consonantly conditioned architectural structures for the implementation of certain processes of governance are developing. Links to the sites of these companies are given. You see, the objective laws of governance are the same, and, therefore, regardless of whether the sufficiently general theory of governance exists or not, any governorial success is based on the fact that people follow exactly these objective laws. Another thing is that, yes, indeed, network models, the apparatus of network planning, network modeling, can be used not only classically for governance towards projects. It can be used to build organizational staff structures and detect defects and flaws in existing organizational staff structures. But it would be wrong to say that this is of a widely used character, because this theme is not even raised in any training course that would touch upon or reveal the problematics of network modeling and network planning. These are questions of culture, the spreadness of culture. And, unfortunately, at the majority of our enterprises, as well as in the state apparatus, many divisions are created not because they are governorially necessary to solve some relevant and stable-in-time tasks. They are created because the organizational staff structure is considered by various internal mafias of enterprises, clan groups in the state, as a kind of chessboard that should be controlled. Therefore, new squares are often created on this chessboard, which push the old squares. The squares that existed before are destroyed, and these processes are in no way connected with increasing the quality of governance, either in the enterprise or in the state as a whole. Therefore, the question of using the network planning apparatus and network models in order to optimize staff structures is a special question and a special theme in the development of governorial culture, because I will say again that it is not the staff schedules that work, but people work, relying on staff schedules. And you can create a very good organizational staff structure, but if you have not provided it with the appropriate qualifications and appropriate ethics, this organizational staff structure will prevent the staff from satisfying the needs of their own egoism. And this will do damage to the cause. Or another organizational staff structure will be required that will allow them, under the guise of engaging in the cause, to satisfy some personal interests. A few more questions. Question: if you were asked to provide adequate criticism regarding the conception of social safety, what would you answer? You see, this question is abstract, demagogic. If it comes to criticism, then let's be specific about what is wrong in the conception, what, in your opinion, needs further development, clarification in the conception, and after that we will discuss the concretics. In the meantime, we are mainly faced with the fact that against the background of the conception, some want to assert themselves, to realize their own personal ambitions. The conception protects itself matrix egregorially from such manifestations, and this usually does not lead to anything good. Question: What is the collective of authors of the internal predictor of the USSR currently working on, and what are the plans for the future? We do not answer such questions, because if someone thinks that some themes are not covered, or not covered properly in the materials of the conception, go ahead, dear comrades, work, develop the conception. This also applies to the next question. Question: what else needs to be said? If you think that there is something else to be said, then say it. Question: are you familiar with the theory of adequate nutrition promoted by Gania Alexandrova Zamilieva? What is your attitude towards her? I have a positive attitude towards her, but I myself love what she condemns. And here the second question arises: how to eat and what to eat. Because in principle, a person can eat anything without harming his health, with the exception of perhaps a small amount of known poisons, such as alcohol, in doses and concentrations more than in kefir and kvass, and of what belongs to psychotropics, poisons. And above all, one must understand that there is a certain correspondence between the physiology of the organism and the psychology of the individual. This mutual correspondence is elastic to some extent, but going beyond these limits leads either to psychological breakdowns or a loss of health. Therefore, the question is not about following some kind of nutrition system that this or that person offers, even if this nutrition system, by his or her personal example, has proven its effectiveness and has led to the fact that someone became a healthy person thanks to this nutrition system and rose from the deathbed. We must look at how the organism reacts. In addition, since we have some prehistory, the prehistory of many generations of life in certain natural and geographical conditions, then genetics, with the change of generations, adapted to the nutrition that took shape in the conditions of these particular natural geographic conditions. And the transition to nutrition systems that took shape in other natural geographic conditions, even if modern logistics and a supermarket allow it, this is not always a safe for health matter. Question: in terms of the conception of social safety, the noosphere is an information field structure. Well, first of all, not an information field structure. This is also a variety of the triunity of matter-information measure. That is, the noosphere as a material object is, first of all, fields. The fields are energetically fed by the organisms of living people, and in some cases, organisms, human biofields, are fed from the noosphere. And then, as an informational algorithmic system, the noosphere is enclosed on the cultures of each of these societies, on the culture of humanity as a whole. And, therefore, it is wrong to speak of the noosphere only as an information field structure. Continuation of the question. Therefore, the noosphere should obey pan-universal objective laws. It is true, the noosphere also obeys. Question. It turns out that the law of informational entropy should apply to the noosphere, but then it turns out that its existence is impossible. You see, the concept of entropy arose from thermodynamics, and then it migrated to information theory. Information theory was created with this concept in mind. But thermodynamics, with its three principles, and information theory, in the form in which it is, are not universal objective laws. There are some local objective laws that do not take into account many factors that really operate in the universe, in creation. Therefore, it is not entirely correct to refer to information theory and entropy, saying that the noosphere cannot exist under these conditions. In general, this theme needs to be delved into, and information theory should be different, but not the one that is now and the one that is used in technology. The situation here is approximately the same as with thermodynamics. Since the middle of the 19th century, from the works of Maxwell, then from the works of Tsiolkovsky, independently of Maxwell, it has been known that the second law of thermodynamics is a limited law, but not a universal principle. One of the formulations of the second law of thermodynamics, a perpetual motion machine of the second kind, is fundamentally impossible. But if the second law of thermodynamics is a limited law, but not a universal principle, then a perpetual motion machine of the second kind is, in a way, technically possible. Accordingly, monotemperature power engineering, which does not require the combustion of gas, oil, and other hydrocarbons, is possible, but it should operate on some other principles. But as long as there is psychological inertia, and as long as there is a policy of profiteering by those who work in the hydrocarbon business, the path to this power engineering will be closed. In addition to this, there are some obvious limitations, since correct physics in the hands of a humanoid monkey is a pan-universal catastrophe. Question. Please comment on the excerpt of the text from the first volume of Dead Water, with concrete examples of low and high frequency observers, and placement in their low frequency range of all code groups of the high frequency range. This is about the fact that the information capacity at one and the same time interval of any high frequency range is greater than the low frequency one in comparison with it. Imagine a situation where you want to broadcast a movie and you have two channels. The channels differ in channel capacity. A high-quality film, that is, every frame is a number of lines and a number of colored pixels in every line. Will the broadcast time of the movie depend on the channel capacity? Yes, it will. Because if the carrier frequency range in the first channel is higher than the carrier frequency range in the second channel, then, through the first channel, you can broadcast this film even faster than real time. And if the second channel has such carrier frequencies that it lags behind real time, then let's say the projection of the film is 24 frames per second and the channel capacity is 1 frame per second. And it will be like this. You need, for 1 minute of viewing, 60 by 24 seconds of uploading, and only then can you watch. Well, when it comes to information coding systems, one should not confuse carrier frequencies and clock frequencies. The clock frequencies set a certain format, and the carrier frequencies, they in fact carry signals, carry clock frequencies. But this is another theme. Therefore, indeed, if an observer lives in a low frequency range of carrier frequencies, then he will not perceive fast processes occurring in high frequency ranges. The performance speed of his psyche as an information processing system is simply not enough. But if, for some reason, the observer shifts to the higher frequency ranges of perception of the world, then those processes that are not usually visible open before his consciousness. Well, watch Trunin's videos on the theme of how he perceived the movement of shells that hit the tank that he was in. And this is not the only evidence, because there is other evidence of war veterans that being in a certain altered state of consciousness, under the influence of other reasons, they saw how the shells exploded, and this process was slow for this perception with consciousness. Although, in order to film the process of a shell exploding, technical means require ultra-high-speed filming at a speed of several 100,000 frames per second. Therefore, this is a question that, well, is difficult to explain. You can only develop your own understanding of this question. Question: what contributes to the working out of the practice of intuitive epiphanies, gaining access to prediction through the heart, and the development of a culture of senses and will? Are there any paintings, sculptures, worth having at home and at work? Thank you. The working out of self-discipline contributes to the working out of the practice of intuitive epiphanies. Because intuitive epiphanies, they usually emerge independently, non-volitionally. If a person is inattentive to this, then they pass by. And then, after a while, he regrets that he was deaf to them or simply did not perceive them, although they were present. This is on the theme, a man is wise in hindsight. Look at Fundamentals of Sociology, the first volume, Our Theory of the Psyche of the Personality, and variants for its work. Therefore, the question is not only in the having of intuitive epiphanies. The question is in the integration of intuitive epiphanies into the process of working out a line of behavior for the future. If this is not the case, then any intuitive epiphanies are useless, and memories of them, after the onset of some troubles, cause only despondency and regret. As for paintings, sculptures, and other decor, whether it is worth having them at home or at work, this is a special theme, because there is what can be called ergonomics of the environment. You can build such an environment at home and at work that it will be depressing. It is possible to build such an environment, both at home and at work, that it contributes to harmony, both in the family and in the activity. As for the works of decorative and applied art, partly their impact on the psyche is conditioned by general ergonomic laws, and partly by the subjectivism of those people who operate in this environment. Therefore, some works of art may be useful to some people, But the same works of art will irritate others or even oppress their activities. Therefore, here you have to be sensitive and meaningfully sensitive. Question. Several years ago, at a lecture available on the internet, Shubin Abramov promised, on condition that he moved, to teach how to create matter from emptiness. If anyone from the internal predictor of the USSR took this up, then what are the results? Once again, the question is not about mastering these or those possibilities, abilities that are perceived in society as extraordinary. In any case, man remains a part of creation. He is limited, both in terms of life and in the paces of perception of information, in conscious comprehension of this information. And the question is not whether you can create matter from emptiness. Emptiness, by the way, is also a type of matter. But the question is whether your limitedness is in harmony with the unlimitedness of almightiness or not. So, if you master some superpowers without worrying about the harmonic relationship with the almightiness, then it may end badly, even if you achieve success. Therefore, I will not answer this question in essence. This refers to idle curiosity. Question. How is the activity of the Institute for Problems of Governance evaluated? The Institute for Problems of Governance existed in Soviet times. If the Institute for Problems of Governance had really worked with problems of governance, transformed them into tasks, and ensured the solution of these tasks scientifically and methodologically, then there would have been no perestroika or many of those things. Therefore, the Institute for Problems of Governance solved some particular problems, mainly of a technical character, successfully. But it did not justify and does not justify its name. Question. Questions of psychology. In what direction, from the point of view of the sufficiently general theory of governance, should empirical research in the field of psychology be carried out? As far as empirical research in the field of psychology, experimental psychology is concerned, this is a double-edged sword, because all experiments in the field of psychology are always a counter-experiment in relation to the one who conducts this experiment. And it may turn out that the conductor of the experimental problem in the field of psychology will not pass the test that he himself conducts. But this is already concretics. Therefore, with questions in the field of experimental psychology, one must be very careful. And in a number of cases, perhaps even in the majority of cases, experimental psychology violates the norms of ethics. Another thing is that the study of the physiological basis of psychological activity is really necessary. But this is another theme. And the physiological basis of psychological activity and psychology must be clearly distinguished in experiments, not to mention the fact that there are some types of activity that do not lend themselves to reproduction in conditions of testing ground experiments. But, nevertheless, it can work. It can manifest itself in the conditions of life reality, because human subjectivism is unique. If not completely, then in some aspects, it is always connected with some egregorial processes, and egregorial processes, the ethics of the noosphere, does not always support idle curiosity. That is, if you conduct an experiment that is, in essence, an expression of idle curiosity, then no result will be obtained. But if a life situation requires something from your psyche, or from the psyche of another person, that was not revealed in these experiments, then the result will be obtained. But science will not agree with this because the result is not reproducible in the conditions of a laboratory or testing ground. Question: which, from the point of view of the sufficiently general theory of governance, psychology of personality do you see? The first volume of the Fundamentals of Sociology, everything is written there. Question: why in the conception of social safety are the types of characters, personal traits, inherent in each type of psyche structure not described? And should this be done? Well, in our opinion, the typology of characters is another theme, and there is no need for this, because there may be some kind of applied need for professional selection, but these are already applied aspects. If we had seen the need for a general social character in building a typology of characters, we would probably have built it. But otherwise, there is no need for it. Question: in accordance with the theory of supersystems and virtual structures, it can be assumed that our entire financial credit system, structured as a sector of the economy, is at the same time a virtual structure of the supersystem into which the Federal Reserve System and similar organizations are incorporated. Mikhail Viktorovich, how many times, in your opinion, does the outflow of money from the country exceed our annual budget? Tens or hundreds of times. You see, I have never been interested in this question because, from my point of view, it is particular in the aspect of a malfunctioning economy. Moreover, if we talk about the financial credit system, then it is not a sector of the economy, as the author of this question writes, but, in fact, it is an instrument for governance towards the economy. And the question is, in whose hands this instrument is. Question: is there a connection between the climatic conditions of life on the planet and the average level of previousness of its population? The question is not meteorologically consistent. What is the average level of previousness of its population? But the fact that the psyche of people exerts an impact on the course of natural processes through the noosphere and through the technosphere, this is really a fact. Question: is a change of the climate on the planet towards warming possible, and as a consequence, a widespread improvement in the living conditions on it, if the previousness of people increases? Why do you think that climate change towards global warming is an improvement in people's lives, and in general, an improvement in the life of the planet? This is a completely different biosphere. And what will you do with those biological species that exist here, in the conditions of this biosphere, if the climate globally changes? Therefore, the question, it is broader and deeper than it's presented in this formulation. Question: how does the collective of authors see the final future of our civilization, technological or biological? About this it is written that we see the final stage in the history of the present civilization as the formation of a biological civilization in which man is free from the technosphere. The way to this stage, it is through hitching the technosphere, subordinating it to man, and harmonizing relations of civilization's nature. Further, in the mode of technospheric support of life, the mastery of the genetic potential of the biological species Homo sapiens is not under the pressure of external circumstances, but proceeding from love, the formation of a biological civilization, and further, into the new stage of the development of civilization, about which we cannot say anything yet, since there is not enough imagination. The next question is devoted to Satanists. If they were not there, then what? So, with regards to questions related to Satanism, why Satan, why did God do this and that, these questions are not for me. The next question is about the definition of a supersystem. During the lectures, I defined a supersystem through the properties of elements, every one of which is capable of self-governance, on the basis of the information and algorithms contained in its memory, able to emit information from its memory to the external environment, able to perceive information and algorithmics from the external environment and other elements. Along with this, the definition given in the materials of the conception, where it is encountered, differs in that another feature appears. Able to perceive information and algorithmics, the ability to more or less complete interchangeability of elements. In my oral speeches, this feature, the ability to more or less complete interchangeability of the elements of the supersystem, I left in the defaults, since, in essence, it is a consequence of the first three ones. First, a plurality is always defined as a plurality of elements that are homogeneous. That is, there are some characteristic features. This homogeneity implies that a certain number of elements can more or less functionally completely replace each other. Nevertheless, this feature of interchangeability is important, because indeed, even if you upload some information into an element of the supersystem, and it is not able to implement this information in activity, then this element will not be able to participate in processes of structureless governance. But still, I will say once again that this fourth feature of interchangeability, in life it is largely a consequence of the first three ones, that is, capable of self-governance, capable of emitting information, capable of receiving information from the environment. And since all elements are elements of a plurality, and a plurality is always characterized by the feature of some similar qualities, the identity of qualities of the elements included in the plurality, then the feature of interchangeability, it is in many ways a consequence. But the question is correct, and the question testifies to the understanding of the essence of the matter by the author of this question. Further on, there is a great amount of text, which I will omit. So, when it comes to supersystems and processes in them, these questions will be covered. Another question. In what do the collective of authors, and you personally, Mikhail Viktorovich, as its representative, see the reasons why the collective of authors does not develop further, and there hasn't been a more complete theory of supersystems over the years, the more complete necessity of which is obvious? How can we help? Well, firstly, the statement that the collective of authors is not developing is a wrong statement. The members of the collective of authors develop personally, and therefore the collective of authors is also developing. As for the theory of supersystems, this is twofold. First, in the form in which it exists, it suits us perfectly, and it allows us to solve the tasks that we solve. Second aspect, the theory of governance is named sufficiently general. This word, sufficiently, implies sufficiency for those who use it. If for someone it is not sufficiently general, then state what is left in the defaults in our version of the sufficiently general theory of governance. Therefore, if you see the need for the development of the theory of supersystems, then by all means develop it, it will only benefit. But don't be graphomaniacal. Question. It's amazing. The degree of blinkered vision is off scale. The lecture describes a typical process of structural governance. Moreover, the entire structure was created precisely under Stalin and with his participation. The interception of the governing structure was not carried out, and the structure began to grind itself. Mobilizational governance, obviously necessary in the era of Stalin, based on a quite enlightened Soviet bureaucracy, created a structure for governing society, showed its effectiveness on the example of the military defeat of Europe. Well, and further in the same spirit. So, if we talk about what showed its effectiveness on the example of the defeat of the fascist European Union, then what are the criteria of effectiveness? For information on the evaluation of effectiveness. Of 95 copies of the built PE-8 bombers. For information, about 12,000 flying fortresses were built in the United States, and about 18,000 liberators were also built, newer analogues of the flying fortresses. Out of 95 built PE-8, 23 perished due to structural defects and underdevelopment of motors and so on. Is this effectiveness? This is despite the fact that the Germans took down 23 PE-8 bombers. Is this the effectiveness of the work of the bureaucracy? Second question. The LA-5 fighter appeared from March to May 1942. What is the LA-5? This is the LAGG-3 fighter, into which the M82 engine was inserted, which was later renamed ASH-82. But when it comes to the history of the LA-5, in most cases, they leave in the defaults the fact that, for the first time, the M82 engine was inserted into the LAGG-3 fighter, not by Lavochkin and his design bureau, but by one of the creators of the LAGG, Mikhail Ivanovich Gudkov, at the end of the summer of 1941, and in October 1941, the GU-82 fighter was tested at the Flight Test Institute. The Air Force demanded mass production of this plane. Nevertheless, for some reason, the People's Commissariat of the Aviation Industry did not organize this mass production, and, moreover, the LA-5 was created in the Lavochkin Design Bureau literally in the course of improvisation when the question about stopping the production of the LAGG-3 fighters arose, since by its flight technical characteristics, they lost to other fighters of the Soviet Army. But pay attention to the fact that if it had not been for the sabotage of the People's Commissariat of the Aviation Industry, The gunfighter, an analog of the LA-5, the GU-82, could have been in mass production 6 months earlier than the LA-5. In practice, this means that the appearance of a qualitatively new fighter at the front would have reduced the losses of Soviet aviation and increased the losses of German aviation. Therefore, when someone talks about the effectiveness of the mobilizational economy of the Stalinist period, this is not necessary. If it had been properly effective, then not only the gunfighter, the analog of the LA-5, would have appeared at the beginning of 1942, but also the tank, the T-34-85, would have appeared not after the Battle of Kursk, but beforehand, and it would have massively taken part in the Battle of Kursk. This would have happened if the governance had been adequate. What am I saying this for? It is not structures that work, but it is people that work, relying on structures, or overcoming those limitations that structures impose on them. And you can build very good, effective structures for both state power and business, but if you have not provided them with personnel whose raviousness and ethics, whose skills allow them to realize the potential of these structures, then you will not succeed. So the question is in essence wrong. If we talk about the Soviet era, then the Constitution of 1936 is indeed one of the best constitutions in history. This constitution did not fully realize its potential. It did not realize it for the simple reason that even before the start of the socialist experiments in Russia, Kluchevsky described their prospects with the words, "Society of a previous community made up of scoundrels." And again, if we go back to the history of the Great Patriotic War, then several Pe-8 aircraft were lost because flame arresters had not been installed on their engines. And the German fighters in the night sky, due to the engine exhaust torches, made visual contact with the bombers and suddenly attacked them from blind spots of their airborne weapons. Flights of the Pe-8 with M82 engines were suspended for several months before the installation of flame arresters on these aircraft. The question is, did they not know from the very beginning that the meter-long engine exhaust would unmask the planes? They knew it. Likewise, intrigue in the People's Commissariat of the aviation industry after the creation of the GU-82 was more significant for someone than the lives of the people at the front, both combat pilots and ground troops with whom aviation was supposed to interact. Therefore, don't talk about structures. Structures without people are dead. It is not organizational staff structures, job descriptions that work, but people. People work with their virtues and vices, including nravious ethical vices. One more question. Another question from the Czech Republic. The comrade asks to show a concrete example of the vector of objectives of governance, the vector of error, and the vector of current state at different stages of the implementation of the entire function of governance. And he asks to build a 4-component vector and show how it is. In dead water, in short course, in Economics of Innovative Development, there is such a picture. This picture shows a 3-component vector of error of governance. Why three-component? Because four or more component vectors of objectives and the vector of error of governance are impossible or problematic to represent graphically. And here is the usual projection, the standard projection for drawing, which represents the three-dimensional vector of error of governance as a deviation from the origin. That is, the vector of objectives of governance is a certain zero in the coordinate system of this here, and accordingly, not zero in another coordinate system which is not shown in the picture. In addition, this picture shows two trajectories along which the vector of error of governance is nullified. These trajectories are conditioned by the priorities of particular objectives, which we combine into the vector of objectives of governance. And depending on how the objectives are enordered in the vector of objectives of governance, either this here lower trajectory or the upper trajectory is optimal. Well, the clump of doodles represents a trajectory in the style of "party, let me steer." That is, when the vector of objectives of governance is not determined, but some movements occur. As a result, nullification of the vector of error of governance is impossible. I will not dwell on this in detail. In dead water, initially this was not included in the sufficiently general theory of governance, just as the discussion of the issue of dynamic programming was not included in the sufficiently general theory of governance, because there was a wish to show informational holisticness by strength of what fell into the content of dead water. And some questions of the application of the sufficiently general theory of governance had already been explained on the example of economics. Therefore, this picture and the pictures connected with the method of dynamic programming and its abstractionism, they got into the second volume, where the applied questions of the use of the sufficiently general theory of governance are considered.
Где рассматриваются прикладные вопросы применения достаточно общей теории управления.
Therefore, I will not answer this in detail and circumstantially. The questions are finished. We can move on to the theme of today's lecture. In the past lectures, we covered a lot of things. What remains to be considered are such things as maneuver and balancing mode. Strong maneuvers and weak maneuvers, and the interconnection between catastrophe theory and the sufficiently general theory of governance. How is it possible to determine the balancing mode? Well, the simplest concept is static equilibrium, a pendulum at its lowest point, a ball on a horizontal surface. Well, what about the dynamics? In dynamics, everything is simple too. the balancing mode. This is a vector of objectives of governance. That is, this is an unchanging in time and practical governance when the vector of error of governance is approximately equal to 0 with sufficient accuracy for practice. Examples: an airplane in flight at an unchanging altitude with an unchanging course. A ship at sea on an unchanging course. Well, what is a maneuver? A maneuver is a transition from one vector of objectives, unchanging in time, to another vector of objectives, which is also unchanging in time. However, the vector of objectives for us is always subjectively determined. And in the vector of the current state, we have quite a few parameters, some of which are included in the vector of objectives, which is set by the governing subject, and some of which are not included in this vector of objectives. Therefore, from the point of view of an outside observer, that which is a maneuver can also be perceived as a balancing mode if the outside observer interpreted the vector of objectives of governance differently, but not in the way said by the governor who organized the process of governance. Therefore, one and the same process, from the point of view of one observer, can appear as a balancing mode, and from the point of view of another observer, that same process can appear as a maneuver mode. For example, the Americans have a modification of the Hercules, the C-130 aircraft, which carries a gun, and the layout of the aircraft is such that it can shoot from one side. Therefore, the tactics of combat use is based on the fact that the Hercules flies around targets and shoots at them. Flying around targets, is it a maneuver or a balancing mode? Depending on how we interpret the vector of objectives, this is a balancing mode or a maneuver, although it is one and the same process. Because if we say that the vector of objectives is unchanging, and we exclude the course from the vector of objectives, then it turns out that the plane flies around at an unchanging speed, with unchanging flow characteristics, and in this case, the process that characterizes the parameters of the aircraft's motion appears to us as a balancing mode. But if we do not include the course in the vector of objectives, then due to the fact that the plane flies around and the course is constantly changing, the same flight mode appears as a maneuver. What else is there? Maneuvers can be divided into two categories: strong and weak maneuvers. What is the difference? The difference is in the character of behavior of the object itself or the process of governance, and in the character of the model on the basis of which we or an outside observer models the behavior of the object. Well, again, examples from aviation. A plane. It is on a straight course. For flight on a straight course at an unchanging altitude in the balancing mode, there is a certain structure of airflow around the aircraft. Certain operating modes of engines are characteristic. Certain modes of functioning of the bodies of governance that support this balancing mode are characteristic. What happens in a weak maneuver? With a weak maneuver, the aircraft will change course and perhaps will change flight altitude. It depends on the character of the maneuver, but the structure of the airflow, the operating mode of the engines, the position of the bodies of governance will be close to what happens in flight on a straight course at an unchanging altitude. However, with the passing of a certain amount of time, the course or flight altitude will change to different ones, after which the aircraft can switch to another balancing mode. This is a weak maneuver. And what is a strong maneuver? A strong maneuver. This is a change in the position of the bodies of governance. There may be a change in the operating modes of the engine, which lead to the fact that the characteristic parameters of the flight, altitude, course, change much faster. But they change much faster on account of the fact that the character of the flow around the aircraft becomes different. Very different from what happens during a direct flight in balancing mode when carrying out weak maneuvers. In the case of strong maneuvers, in relation to the aircraft, a very strong lateral flow component appears. And on account of the strongest lateral component of flow, the whole picture of the airflow around the aircraft changes. Its aerodynamic characteristics change. The effect of forces on the aircraft structure changes. Accordingly, there may be problems with robustness. And if we talk about governance towards aircraft, then, in fact, the course and altitude can be changed both by strong and by weak maneuvers. But during strong maneuvers, one must remember about the safety restrictions connected both with the robustness of the aircraft and with the possibility of stalling into a spin, from which not all aircraft can egress. But the distinction between strong maneuvers and weak maneuvers, it is of interest in the aspect of modeling, because the mathematical models of the process can be different. And if, for example, you use a complete mathematical model of the aircraft flight, then, in the balancing modes, and in the mode of weak maneuvers, some coefficients will have values close to 0 or 0, and you can ignore them. On account of this, the mathematical model will be significantly simplified. Well, the simplification of the mathematical model is always a certain saving of computing power in the process of calculating and modeling certain flight modes. Therefore, in a number of cases, those tasks that simple computers can solve using simplified models, in the case of using complete models, will require involvement of supercomputers, computers of significantly higher power and performance.
моделей будут требовать привлечения суперкомпьютеров. Компьютеров существенно
Therefore,
более
the
высокой
division of
мощности
maneuvers into strong and weak maneuvers in
Поэтому
the aspect of
разделение
modeling
на
when solving the
вопросы
task
не
of stability of
ставит
object of governance in terms of
в
predictability of
аспекте
behavior
моделирования
is
при
really
решении
relevant.
задачи об устойчивости объекта управления в смысле предсказуемости поведения, оно действительно актуально. Но
But strong
осиленные
maneuvers
маневры,
do not allow to
они не
simplify
позволяют
mathematical models in the process of modeling and solving the
упрощать
task of
математические
stability in
модели
terms
в
of
процессе
predictability,
моделирования
or they allow to
решения
simplify
задачи об
to a limited
устойчивости в
extent.
смысле предсказуемости, либо позволяют ограниченно упрощать. И поэтому вот
And
такое
therefore,
разделение,
this
которое
division,
не
which is
всегда
not always
правильно
relevant
применимо
specifically
на
for the
практике
practice of maneuvering,
маневрирования, оно
turns
оказывается
out to be
актуальным
relevant
для
for the
практики
practice of the
решения
solution of
задач об
tasks of stability
устойчивости
in
в
terms of
смысле
predictability.
предсказуемости.
That
То
is,
есть
the relevance of
актуальность
the division
сильных и
into
слабых
strong and
сторон
weak
и
maneuvers in
относительные
the
свойства
process of
маневра в
maneuvering.
процессе маневрирования, она
It is
обусловлена
conditioned
только
only by
вопросами
questions of safety in
безопасности
the
в
process of
процессе
maneuver
маневра
and
и
questions of
вопросами
maneuvering as such.
маневрирования как такового,
That
то
is,
есть предварительного
preliminary solution
решения
of the task of
задачи
stability in terms
устойчивости
of
в смысле
predictability.
предсказуемости. А
And the
ситуации
situations
сами по
themselves
себе,
can
они
be
могут
such
быть такими, что
that
слабый
a
маневр
weak
или
maneuver or
сильный
a strong
маневр
maneuver
это не
is
имеет
irrelevant in
значения для
relation to the final
отношения
result
конечного
of the
результата
maneuver.
маневра.
One
Один
and the same result
результат
can be
может быть
obtained
получен
both
в
as a
результате
result of a
сильного
strong
маневра
maneuver
и в
and as a
результате
result of a
слабого.
weak maneuver.
Кроме того, вопросы маневрирования
In addition, the question of maneuvering and balance modes in the aspect of solving the task of stability of object in terms of predictability of behavior, they are connected with modeling, and the models can be different. Different both in the aspect of information and in the aspect of physical carriers. Therefore, the theory of governance is always connected with that which is called similarity theory. Similarity theories answer the question, what combination should be multiplied by this or that specific characteristic of a model object, of a model process, in order to obtain a reliable, with an acceptable accuracy for practice, characteristic of a full-scale object that you are going to govern.
Натурного объекта, которым вы собираетесь управлять.
Similarity theories in every applied area, in every subject domain, are different. But, nevertheless, it is necessary to know that the exit from the modeling of questions into practical activity, it is quite often conditioned by the existence of a similarity theory, because modern aviation, sea transport, many types of weapons, they exist in the form in which they are, only thanks to the fact that similarity theories have been developed in the corresponding sector of technology, which make it possible to answer the question, how, on the basis of the characteristics of the model, to determine the full-scale characteristics of the real object that is proposed to be created. After all, if we use a model of an airplane in a wind tunnel, then the forces and moments that affect it are different from those forces and moments that will affect a real airplane. And in order to move from the Boeing 747 model to the real Boeing 747, it is necessary to make certain calculations based on the similarity theory which has been developed in aerodynamics. It is precisely the existence of similarity theory that makes it possible to solve the task of stability in terms of predictability of the behavior of a real object in those cases where the construction of a real object is labor-intensive and expensive. And, moreover, testing a real object at random can be dangerous, both for the object itself and for those around it. Therefore, the question of similarity theory in concrete terms is really relevant when solving all tasks of stability in terms of predictability. And questions about similarity theory are relevant, both in relation to balancing modes and in relation to maneuvers. If there is no similarity theory, you will be forced to experiment on full-scale objects, the cost of which and the damage from the malfunctioning of which may turn out to be unacceptable. But similarity theory is always the concretics of every applied field of activity. Therefore, in the sufficiently general theory of governance, you can mention similarity theories. You can talk about the need for their creation and development in the corresponding field of activity where you intend to deal with the solution of tasks of governance. But in every field of activity, the similarity theory is always concrete. In addition, similarity theory, it enables to simplify, in some cases, the modeling of the behavior of objects using other physical carriers. In an era when computing power was represented by an arithmometer and a slide rule, computational tables such as Brady's tables, tables of logarithms, many engineering tasks by computational methods could not be solved for the simple reason that there was not enough computing power. And with that computing power that engineers had, actually, it took decades or centuries even to calculate the corresponding models. But many dynamic tasks were described by the same equations by which electronic circuits were described. This opened up the possibility of modeling such processes as the flight of an airplane, the flight of a rocket, on the basis of various kinds of electronic circuits, and on the basis of what came to be known as analog computing machines. A certain electronic circuit was built on the basis of similarity theory. This electronic circuit, in terms of mathematical description, was identical to an airplane, rocket, ship, submarine, some other process that was modeled, or the behavior of an object that was modeled. After that, a current was applied to the electronic circuit. A certain process took place in the circuit, after which voltmeters, ammeters, oscilloscopes made it possible to record this process, and by the character of the process taking place in the electronic circuit, it was possible to judge the behavior of a real object that was supposed to be implemented on another physical carrier, processes that would be characteristic of this object. It was only necessary to recalculate the data taken from the process of functioning of the electronic circuit for the full scale of characteristics of the object. If the mathematical model of the object was built correctly, if it was metrologically consistent, then modeling on an analog machine made it possible, at the pace of object design, to solve the tasks of stability in terms of predictability of its behavior and obtain results that are quite acceptable for practice. Further, there is one more question. This is a question about catastrophe theories. Well, the catastrophe theory is about the fact that there may be a slow process, minor changes in which lead this process to the so-called bifurcation point. And at the bifurcation point, there is an almost instantaneous transition of this process or governed system into a certain triple quality. The trajectory along which this process flows is in many cases not predictable. The quality that arises by strength of the unpredictability of the trajectory can also be unpredictable in general, or predictable in a certain probabilistic statistical sense. Well, catastrophe theory, in a number of cases, is used as an excuse for such tricks as Gaidar's shock therapy. They say that the original mode of the system's functioning is unacceptable, a new mode is required, but we can transit to the new mode only through a catastrophe. Well, maybe it is really so. A particular case in which the transition to a new mode of system functioning is possible only through a catastrophe. But if we consider the general case, then the process takes place in a certain space of formal parameters. That is, this is a multidimensional space. If the process leads to the point of bifurcation, then, in the terms of the sufficiently general theory of governance, the point of bifurcation is the point of loss of stability of the object of governance in terms of predictability of its behavior. It may indeed be that the bifurcation point, the point of loss of stability in terms of predictability of behavior, cannot be bypassed in any way. And then a catastrophe is really alternativeless. What will happen after it is unknown or predictable in a certain probabilistic statistical sense. That is, maybe this way, maybe that way, maybe in some third way, and the probabilities of transition to a particular quality after the bifurcation point in a number of cases can be evaluated, but the question immediately arises about the reliability of these evaluations. But if, nevertheless, to solve the task of stability of a process or an object in terms of predictability of its behavior, then, in the general case, situations are possible when the bifurcation point can be bypassed and a different quality of system functioning without catastrophes can be reached. Therefore, the sufficiently general theory of governance presupposes the concretics of the analysis of the question of whether a transition to a new quality of a system or process, bypassing a catastrophe, is possible, or a catastrophe is alternativeless. In the majority of cases, a catastrophe is harmful to processes. Well, this is again a question of concretics. Because if we talk about what in the religious world understanding is called transformation, then this is also an almost instantaneous transition from one quality of the system to another quality of the system. And from the standpoint of catastrophe theory, transformation is a catastrophe. Another thing is that this catastrophe is not accompanied by the emergence of results that are unacceptable for those who are going through the transformation. Therefore, this is, in fact, a philosophical question of the interconnection between the sufficiently general theory of governance and catastrophe theory, which must be borne in mind when solving concrete tasks and setting concrete tasks of governance. Because the mode of functioning of the system may be unacceptable. The desired mode can be determined, but it is possible to transit to the desired mode through a catastrophe and bypassing a catastrophe. But in order to avoid a catastrophe, the bifurcation point, you must correspondingly solve the task of stability of the behavior of the object in terms of predictability of its behavior. In connection with this, again, we must recall what was previously called the monkey's paw effect. The monkey's paw effect is a literary metaphor. It stems from an English story where the owner of a dried monkey paw, some kind of object of power, was faced with the fact that his wishes were fulfilled, but they were accompanied by unacceptable negative effects. Well, he wanted to get rich. His uncle died, leaving an inheritance. He got rich, but his beloved uncle died, an unacceptable effect. Now the monkey's paw metaphor is giving way to the black swan metaphor. There is a book written by an Arab American that all changes in the world occur through catastrophes. The unpredictable character of catastrophes he called the black swan effect. And this metaphor of the black swan, for many, is a deterrent factor, blocking the analysis of processes. And in accordance with such an approach, that there are things that are inherently unpredictable and ungovernable, attitudes to the economy in a liberal market ideology are built. Because economic crises are considered in principle unpredictable. And if they are unpredictable, then there is no point in preventing crises. But the economic system, the social economic system, must have such a quality that in the event of a crisis, it quickly mobilizes and in some way reacts to the crisis, structurally transforming itself and entering into a different mode of governance.
Касается эффектов обезьяньей лапы, теории катастроф, прилеты
Well,
черных
what is a
лебедей,
social economic crisis? This is primarily a discomfort for many. In some cases, a life catastrophe, the collapse of fate, the collapse of life, or premature so-called natural death, either attempted suicide or suicide by strength of the loss of the meaning of life. That is, everything related to the monkey's paw effects, catastrophe theory, the arrival of black swans, which changes life in an unpredictable way, and then these catastrophes must be overcome. But in general, from the point of view of the sufficiently general theory of governance, this is not the right thing to do. It is necessary to solve the task of stability in terms of predictability of the behavior of objects in such a way that bifurcation points, catastrophe points, are bypassed. And again, if we look at the relatively recent history in applied aspects, then the financial economic crisis of 2008 and subsequent years was made on the basis of the recipes of the Nobel laureates in economics. This is one of the indicators of the failure of Western-type economic science as an applied version of theory of governance. And on the other hand, it is a hint that, nevertheless, the questions of social economic governance should be dealt with, and governance should be built in such a way that there will be no catastrophes. But here already other ethical aspects arise, because the absence of social economic catastrophes, that is, consumer well-being for all, and non-human types of psyche structure as a statistical dominant in the life of society, these are incompatible things. If effective governance towards the economy is achieved, when the tasks of economic support for the life of each and every one, state politics are solved. But nraviousness and ethics still remains the nraviousness and ethics of a crowd elite society, the nraviousness and ethics of a monkey herd. If we take the achievement of culture out of consideration, then further the mechanisms of self-destruction of this civilization come into play. That is, the task of social economic governance should include not only the aspects of a productional distributional character, but also aspects of the interaction of civilizations with the biosphere, and the aspects of upbringing of precisely a human, but not of a herd pack monkey slightly tamed by civilization. Further, if you look at the life of civilizations from the position of the sufficiently general theory of governance, then what has received the name Overton window technology, this is actually a weak maneuver. That is, slow, sequential, insignificant at first glance, changes of the current state of the system, and insignificant changes, when viewed at short intervals of time, entail qualitative changes in the system at long intervals of time. This is a weak maneuver. In the aspect of social governance, everything that concerns weak maneuvers is questions of the theory of hybrid war, because in modern conditions the terms globalization and hybrid war, they are factually synonyms. And if we talk about achieving objectives in a hybrid war, both in the aspect of aggression and in the aspect of protection from aggression, prevention from aggression, this is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, a weak maneuver. Moreover, the weakness of maneuvers is conditioned not only by our desires, not only by the wishes to perhaps hide actions leading to certain results, to make them invisible to the enemy in a hybrid war. This is conditioned by the fact that no processes in the life of society can flow faster than this is allowed by the psychodynamics of society. That is, the egregorial system of society, when everyone acts as he wants, in accordance with his nraviousness, in accordance with his world understanding, in accordance with his skills. Everyone acts as he wants, or he does not act as he wants. And in the end, we get what we get. Because egregors work, social psychodynamics works. Psychodynamics has a certain inertia, and it does not allow to act faster than it allows. Well, this is such a paradoxical phrase. Therefore, you can write the Constitution of 1936, but if the psychodynamics of society does not allow living according to the Constitution of 1936, then you get a creeping coup d'etat, begun in 1953 with the murder of Stalin and Beria, and completed in 1993 with the adoption of the bourgeois liberal constitution of the Russian Federation, which corresponded to the psychodynamics of the society, which was influenced by weak impacts. But weak impacts entailed what is called weak maneuvers, or the Overton window, which is gradually shifting, and shifting. Well, read The Golden Calf. Ostap Bender returns with a suitcase full of money, and his neighbors and his compartment are students traveling from apprenticeship. As soon as the students are convinced that Ostap is a millionaire, Bender finds himself alone, because the nraviousness of that era did not accept such an enriched person. By the end of the existence of the Soviet Union, the monuments to Bender stood in at least 5 cities in the territory of the Soviet Union, and Ostap Bender was one of the role models, especially for the younger generation entering into life. This is a purpose-oriented impact on the psychodynamics of society in order to move from socialism to the restoration of capitalism, and so that no one, in essence, would object. In 1959, a film named Some Like It Hot was released in the United States, but in Russian we know it as There Are Only Girls in Jazz. The film ends with a scene when a millionaire invites a man disguised as a woman to marry him. The character says, "It's impossible. Why? You don't understand, Osgood. I'm a man. Well, nobody's perfect." That's where the film ends. Now, representatives of the LGBT community have become more active and demand the recognition of the legal codification of their special rights. In the aspect of hybrid warfare, this is aggression. The ultimate objective is the destruction of the institution of the family. The institution of the family is the foundation of society, because all social institutions were generated by the institution of the family, and the institution of the family, as necessary in historical development, generates new social institutions. Simply, if the enemy cannot be destroyed by methods of a hot war, it is destroyed by methods of the Cold War. In the past it was named this way, or hybrid war, as it is called now. What works in it? A set of objective laws works, to which the life of human society, the life of every individual, is subordinated. And in order to achieve results, it is necessary to solve the task of stability in terms of predictability of behavior, and to introduce society into a mode of maneuver. But by strength of the peculiarities of society, the mode of maneuver may not be strong, because the psychodynamics of society has its own inertia, but weak maneuvers allow one to bring any society to what one, as a governor, wants. And if you want the transformation of the planet of the monkeys into the planet of humans, into the earth of humans, then you must work towards this, exerting an impact on the psychodynamics. The maneuvers will be weak, but they will be effective. The weakness of the maneuvers implies their duration, and accordingly obliges you to selflessness. But self-servingness obliges to maintain a system of weak maneuvers of an aggressor who exploits self-servingness. But this leads in the long term to the self-destruction of civilization, since the power of the technosphere, the power of parapsychology, magic, are incompatible with the ethics and raviousness of the herd pack monkey, and this civilization generates the processes of self-liquidation. There is only one alternative to them: the impact on the psychodynamics in such a way that the transformation, in the end, is accomplished. Well, that's it for today. Thank you.